Thank you everyone for joining us today. We have a very exciting webinar to share with you. And I don't think this is going to be your typical webinar, um, but what makes things different here is we're going to have an amazing conversation with Julia and Amy. And the idea is not for you to sit back and listen for the next 30, 45 minutes and be like, that was interesting. We want you to go home with at least four actionable takeaways from this webinar and things that you could implement in your own go-to-market motions. And so we're going to recap that at the end of the webinar so you know how you can take what we talk about in this webinar and make it actionable. I know this question comes up every single webinar I do is yes, it will be recorded, and yes, we will send it to you right afterwards. And in the chat, there's a Q&A section. Inbar from my marketing team is monitoring that, and she will then moderate those questions to us at the end, and we're going to do our best to leave enough time to answer those questions. She also yelled at me a little behind the scenes here to talk slower because not everyone here is from New York, like myself. So I will do my best, but I am excited, and when I'm excited, it's hard for me not to slow down. So the reason I'm excited is because Amy and Julia are amazing at what they do, and they've built some incredible stuff. And I can't wait for them to share that with you. But before we do that, let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I joined Similarweb about 2.5 years ago. I lead our sales intelligence solution here at Similarweb. Very varied background from large companies like Goldman Sachs and Akamai to startups, a couple of exits, clearly not enough because I'm still here. But really, everything about sales, go-to-market, product, and just really passionate, especially about AI and all the amazing things it can do. And that's, a very quick intro on myself. With that, let me hand it over to Julia.
Hey guys, Julia here. I am the Director of Demand Generation and Marketing Operations here at Rakuten Advertising. A little bit quick overview of myself as well. I bring over probably a decade of experience building marketing systems, data infrastructure, and full funnel revenue engine. So really using the data to drive business impact is kind of my wheelhouse.
Amazing. Amy.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Amy Pierce, Director of AI Adoption. I've actually been at Rakuten quite a long time, over 14 and a half years. The better part of that was actually spent interfacing directly with our advertisers. But over the last year, I've moved into that AI adoption role, and that means a couple of things. It means making sure that across the organization, people have the AI tools and the training that they need to get their job done more efficiently and effectively. But it also means building really cool things like Julie and I did.
Amazing. And guys, if I think Julia and Amy were being, downplaying how talented they are, and I think you'll get it and see that in a couple of minutes. Why I'm so excited for them to join us. But before we get started, I'm sure a lot of people, most people are already familiar with Rakuten, but maybe Julia, you can give us a quick overview of Rakuten Advertising.
Yeah, of course. Would love to. So, Rakuten Advertising, we are a global affiliate network and performance intelligence partner with local in market and vertical expertise. For the folks on the call, affiliate is a marketing performance channel that really helps brands connect with their audiences across the funnel from first impression to final sale. But Rakuten Advertising, we are part of a larger Rakuten ecosystem. We do fall under a Rakuten Group, which is like a Japanese conglomerate with well over 70 services under its umbrella. Here at RAD, we have well over 850 employees with dedicated offices across the world from the US, Canada, UK, APAC, Brazil, Australia, and more, with our headquarters being in San Mateo, California.
Amazing. I will say I'm not only the leader of this webinar, but I'm also a Rakuten customer. So thank you very much for the check I just got for $39.78. Literally got it last week. That was not planned. Before we get started, we're going to do a little poll here. So if you could, Inbar, launch that poll for the audience. What we want to know is about your CRM, right? Do you completely trust that data, right? Would you say that it's, fine-ish, there's some gaps. Total chaos, right? right? Or what CRM data asking for a friend.
Mm.
So I know there's a couple of people who say crystal clear are completely trusted data so far. I want to talk to you guys because you know, that must be amazing. Because
Maybe they can host the next webinar.
yeah, absolutely. We may want to hear from you guys. They're very small, but we're going to give it another 20 seconds or so. We have some really great participation. Over 50% have participated. Um, so very good. So we'll give it another 10 seconds if you haven't responded yet. Here's your chance. Closing it on over 60%. So, okay. Inbar, let's close it in 5 seconds or so. Okay. So as you can see, I'm actually again, as we said, the crystal clear are three people. We'll talk offline because we'd love to know some tips. I am a little surprised. I thought total chaos or what CRM data would get more, but it's probably aggregated. That's 41%. And finish and other gaps, right? 55%. And I think, most people, and obviously we're just kidding with the crystal clear folks, but most people, right, when we think about our CRM data, right, this is what it feels like, right? It's fine, right? As half the people said, but for the other half, it's total chaos, right? And this is you're not alone, right? And we feel this, and Rakuten deals with, and this is a lot of companies are struggling with this, where data's all over the place. But maybe Amy, can you give us a little bit, more detail in terms of where does data sit within Rakuten, and even not just talking about your CRM, but all over, and kind of what are some of the challenges that you guys have in terms of with this very messy, as we say, using our theme of the cooking theme. And I do want to say amazing backgrounds to Julie and Amy. I feel embarrassed with my background, but thank you for staying on theme. But kind of in this messy kitchen of data, talk to a little bit about what you guys are seeing.
Yeah, I think we've probably all felt like the dog in the previous slide, right? And this is what you're looking at, our actual messy kitchen. And I would venture to guess, like Jonathan said, it probably looks a lot like yours, right? You have your CRM data, your outreach flows, you have a target account list that might be living on your representative desktop, like literal desktop. Similar web data, call recordings, an internal database, which may or may not have all of the information, all of that contact enrichment you're looking to do, and regional rules. So all of this is in play. All of it has different owners, and some of those owners might even have different definitions of what that very same field means, right? So every one of these sources does contain valuable things. And the problem never is that the data doesn't exist, right? The problem is it's in this messy state. And it's kind of not necessarily that the data is even wrong, right? It's just that it's everything everywhere all at once. But this mess existed long before AI. And I think that's kind of the point, right? We've been managing this complexity completely manually before we even touched an AI tool. And we're doing that probably like a lot of you are with tribal knowledge from our reps. They've been around long enough to know which fields to trust, which to ignore, right? AI didn't come in and create this data complexity, but it does make the cost of ignoring all of these complex data and disparate data sources right much higher, because when you build an agent that's running on top of this messy kitchen, it's not going to clean up the mess for you, right? It's just going to continue to cook with it at scale and incredibly fast. So that's really what we were working with when we were going into this project.
I would kind of say, Amy, just to add on that, I think it exacerbates the problem,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
And one of the things I love, whether I use Claude or Cursor or whatever tool, and it gives you an obvious fake response, and you're like, "That's not right." You look at this data, and it's like, "Oh, you're right. Well, good call. Way to catch it." And that's
Yeah.
so frustrating. I mean, I joke to my team. I send it real life. My wife said, "You do the dishes?" I'm like, "Yeah." She goes, "Why are they still in the sink?" I'm like, "No, you're absolutely correct. Sorry, my bad." So, it's, this idea is a real challenge, right? And it gets
Yeah.
exacerbated by AI. So, right, when we have that same issue, right, and we have all these multiple systems, right, and it's so critical, right, especially when it comes to AI, which is just, and I think one of the reasons why it's exacerbating the problem is because it's moving at a much faster speed than we
Yeah.
do, right? How do we know which data we should trust? How do we know which is actionable? How do we separate the noise, right? Like, where do we even start here?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think you actually have to even start before the data. So before you're going to connect to anything, you need to really agree with your team on what you're actually describing. So in our instance, for this use case, it was an advertiser account. What does the complete picture of that account actually look like? And I think once you actually know that, then all of these different systems, they kind of stop feeling like chaos, right? Because they each have their own job. Salesforce is going to tell you the relationship history. Similarweb gets to tell you what's happening on their website right now. And Gong can tell you what's actually going on in conversations, but none of them is telling you the whole story. So I think when you give each one a clear lane, you can really start to pull them together. And as far as what's actionable, which is noise, I think you can get a lot out of looking at this the same way we learned about looking at stories when we were all in grade school, right? Those 6 questions: who, what, where, when, how, and why. And I'm going to give you a bonus tip here. That is also a really great way to write an effective AI prompt in any LLM, right? Just answer those questions for it and your output will be much better. But it also really works for your data too. So when it comes to who, like who owns this data and who do you need to get in the room to talk about it? And this one is probably what saved us the most pain in this project, right? So before you go write that single line of code or logic or AI prompt, you got to find the humans who actually own each system and really make good friends with them, right? So that's also helped us a lot, I think, Julie and I. But understand what the data is built to do, what the API can and can't do, what kind of API key you actually need, what the edge cases are that are not going to be in any of the documentation. The people who are in those systems day to day are going to be the ones that you want to talk to, right? So a 20-minute conversation now can save you heartache down the road. And I think what is probably the most important part, right? And I talked about that a little bit ago, but it's for us, what we were actually looking for describing is going to be the advertiser, a new to file advertiser to our system. So every system, every field, every signal that we're going to look to incorporate has to go back to the advertiser, right? Everything else outside of that is just noise. But once you've kind of collated on that, it's way easier to decide what belongs and what doesn't. Where does it live? Where does it need to travel, to be useful? For us, that was our CRM data in Salesforce, right? Web signals in the Similarweb, maybe those target lists on the rest desktops. But none of it was in one place. So mapping it was really the key there. And I think is marking out where all of this data lives is going to get you so far down the road. The when piece is when is this going to data be updated? You got to keep really close tabs on that. Stale data is just not going to produce mediocre data. It's going to actively mislead the whole thing at scale, right? So we did build in rules, signals where we have defined time windows, and anything outside of those windows, it gets flagged and not acting upon. So in this way, timing becomes more of a governance decision, not just a nice to have. And the final two, why and how. So, why does the source belong in the system? Everything that you're going to add into your agent is going to give you a maintenance commitment and a potential failure point in the future, right? So, we added in Similarweb because it answered questions that our CRM could not. As well as it enriched our leads so that we could utilize then Gong to send that automated outreach. But everything else had to earn its place into the agent, right? You can't articulate why the source is there, it's probably not making your data very actionable anyways. And finally, how is it flowing through the system? And how do you know if something goes wrong? And I think that's what a lot of teams fail to document. Julia is really what saved us here. She built QA fields at every stage, metadata that let us trace everything. And it's that how that's really making that data actionable, right? Not just available to you.
Yeah, well, I think first of all, it's amazing takeaway, right? And we talked about this. This wasn't even in our standard takeaways, but I think when we recap, I think the who, what, where, why, and how we'll definitely
Mhm.
add. Um, and I think also like just on a very personal level, right? And I can't wait to talk to Julie about this in a second, is one of the frustrations I have, right, in terms of building skills or prompts is that we joked about it before, but it not listening, right? And how do
Yes.
you do the QA and how do you make sure that even though I told you to take step one, it's actually taking step one? So I think that's a great segue, right, to Julia. So Julia, right, we talked about, right, what data, right, and Amy kind of gave us the who, what, where, when, whys, but tell me specifically about, your challenges, right? Because it wasn't just, as Amy said, about the data, but like what else were some of the challenges you had to deal with, right, before we even talk about what you guys built?
Yeah, absolutely. I think kind of harping back to what you both have said before, the challenge was we did have a landscape of pretty disparate data sources across all of the different tech stack. It was pretty hard to understand, how do the systems feed into each other? And pretty early on, we saw many, many opportunities to really start scaling our go-to-market engine. But then, we ran into blockers of, well, it's a manual process, they're in different
Hmm.
systems, the teams are so small. How do we begin to really scale these efforts in a way where we're leveraging agentic AI, all of our data systems and platforms so that we can actually drive business impact? And the challenge we'll talk through today really served as the basis for how we're deploying many other automation projects. I think like this one is just near and dear to me because we actually did drive tangible pipeline and revenue results. And so I'd love to talk through kind of really quickly, Jonathan, if I may, kind of like the problem or a project we were trying to tackle here.
So absolutely, but Julia, don't bury the lead. Can you give us like ballpark, what some of the tangible results you saw were?
Yeah, within, I want to say 3 to 4 months, we drove millions in pipeline.
Guys, I mean that's what we led with the webinar. So this is not just, oh, that's cool, that's amazing, right? This is what, Julia and Amy built is millions of dollars of net new pipeline, right? So this is like, and that's why we want to be so focused on the takeaways that you can all implement because done the right way, it's, the ROI here is huge. But with that, let me hand that back to you, Julia. Talk to me about kind of the data foundation of what you guys built. And then Amy, if you can kind of just jump in and talk about the agentic workflow behind it would be super helpful.
Yeah, let me maybe give some context to our listeners. I'm sure they're taking down notes as we speak. So, the project and that I'm sort of referencing for this particular use case, we wanted to really streamline the efforts of our outbound process. Just we have 4 BDRs supporting our entire sales team. It's pretty small compared to other, tech SaaS companies that I've worked in before. And so we thought, well, how do we scale their efforts to drive prospecting and pipeline creation? But their efforts were disjointed, manual, not from any fault of their own, but kind of like we mentioned before, disparate data, unstructured, structured. They're having to context switch constantly from account research to prospecting research. Then they're, having to then go and enrich it, validate the data, synthesize it, craft copy, and it would really take up to an hour to prospect one account. Not great, not scalable, not efficient. And we were thinking, how could we flip this on its head so that if we automated many of these processes, BDRs were then qualifying meetings, they were constantly replying back to folks, creating pipeline, right, so on and so forth. And so if we really think about, we wanted to prioritize the BDR's time, we really had to break down every single part of what they were doing, where things were broken, so that we could build it back up layer by layer. And so the data foundation was absolutely the first part of this solution or project.
Amazing. And Julia, at a high level, can you talk to us a little bit about what you were doing on the agentic workflow? And then we'll kind of dive into that in more detail in a couple of slides, but just at a high level would be super helpful.
Well, once you have that foundation of the solid data layer that Julia laid out, the agentic layer can really run on top of it reliably, right? It's the part that acts for you. It's the automating of the outreach, that scaling of the volume. And hopefully what we're enabling to do, to Julia's point, is enable the team to do that high value work, right? We want them to be talking to these prospective advertisers and closing the deal, but it only works because of what Julia described. The agent's not touching the raw data. It operates on structured, enriched, trusted inputs that right have already been cleaned up and presented to them. That data layer is a governance problem, but the workflow layer, that agentic piece, that's the automation problem, right? You can't conflate them. You can't build an agent that's trying to make data quality decisions, right? We are passing it to that agent already clean.
Yeah, I would say just something, I talk to tons of different customers, right, in many, many different verticals. And I would say one of the things that I consistently hear, right, from sales leadership is we want to decrease the amount of non-revenue generating activities, right,
Mhm.
that our sellers are, right? That is something we constantly hear. And I think, when you think about the outcome that you guys drove from only 4 BDRs, with millions of pipelines in that time frame is amazing, right? And I'm sure it had to do with decreasing the amount of time they're spending on all those non-revenue generating activities to get them on the phone, to get them making calls. So like to me, that I think the summary, and this is what we hear, is that done the right way, right? Even with a small team, right? If you can have them focus on what they're great at, right?
Hmm.
And decrease that non-revenue generating activity, right? That's the model for success. So, with that, Julia, let's dive into the details here. So, this is the meat of the presentation. So, give us like kind of to steal from Amy, the who, what, why, how you made this happen.
Yes, great. Would love to go through it. I think, for the RevOps folks on the call, I'm sure you've all heard garbage in, garbage out. It's sort of like what Amy said. Before we touched anything in our agentic platform, we needed to get our house in order. We need to really assess the data maturity across the entire tech stack. And on the flip side, what I'll say is besides the crystal, in our poll, the three people that said their CRM is perfect, your database will never also be 100% clean. So a lot of the groundwork we put in place was also understanding, well, what was the operational, like minimum operational requirements we needed from a data foundational perspective to get this out the door. Because again, we wanted to scale, we wanted to do this quickly, we wanted to generate business impact. And so as we were sort of collating our requirements, we first and foremost, before we cleaned up anything, we really did align with stakeholders on, who were our ICP. We needed to tighten up like the targets we wanted to go after so we could really identify all the different dimensions of data that were pertinent to outreach, whether that was targets, tiers, vertical, subverticals, traffic, competitive intel, revenue, right? We needed to understand what were all the things we needed in order to start building. Of course, we needed to also understand our source of truth and where did that source of truth originated from. I just like talk through quite a few dimensions of fields and variables. All of those data points come also from different places within the tech stack. And as we were building out the requirements, cleaning up and mapping all the data, we also had to understand, well, now that we're introducing an agent, suddenly we needed to clarify the roles of engagement. There's a BDR, there's a sales rep, and there's, the agent itself. Who did what and what, within each sales cohort, what level of depth or permission sets, data did they each need in order to do their job, and how did they each work together to really drive towards prospecting an account? So as we put together really that framework of what we needed, the fields, we started to clean, structure, and map all the data. We started to understand, well, what were the fields across the different objects, across the different tech stack that we needed to start talking to each other. Because again,
Hmm.
like we mentioned before, data was not talking to each other previously. And then based on, where we were, what data we had, we had to then understand what data were we missing and where can we go and find it. And so, enrichment and validation was really that next step of, okay, across all of our tech stack, what are all the tools at play that we can really start bringing in information, Similarweb being one of them. We also used different APIs from other tools that we had in our tech stack. And from there, we did leverage a lot of those data points to help us prioritize our outreach, to help us, understand who we wanted the agent to go after versus the
Hmm.
BDR, or really who is irrelevant, or, who did we want to suppress from the total initiative. And so as we began to, first crawl, walk, run methodology, what we very quickly realized was we needed to put in many guardrails to enable human oversight and reporting. And so from a governance perspective, we also created new fields, processes to, log timestamps, summary fields, outreach flags, whether in the CRM, whether in other systems, so that we could really wrap our hands around this project from a data foundation layer. And again, this is everything that happened even before we pushed data over to our agentic, platform.
Amazing. First of all, it's, I think it looks simple, right? But
Right.
I know like with any good recipe, right, you break a lot of eggs in the process. So I'm sure, and if anyone, again, I'll remind you if you have any questions and answers, questions, I should say, hopefully we could provide the answers. Please, put it in the Q&A section. And, myself or Julie or Amy are happy to kind of answer as many questions as we can at the end. I have one quick question though, Amy, Julia, sorry. Um, when we think about the implementation phase, right? How did the BDRs react, right, to this new platform, right, and this new system?
Oh, that's a great question. You know, the BDRs were pretty much involved from day one. We wanted them to feel like this agent was really there. It was like their partner in
Mhm.
crime. You know, we were trying to help them hit their targets. And so if we gave them more space to be creative, to do that tier one messaging, to, really focus on qualifying booking meetings, suddenly, a lot of mental load was taken off their plate. You know, they did have a lot more space to do much more interesting things. And to your point, I think earlier, like the non-revenue generating tasks
Mhm.
were suddenly things that we automated out of their plate. And they were very, very important for us from a feedback loop perspective, especially as we were getting responses, as our agents were crafting messaging. They really helped us tweak and finesse the different levers that, we needed to maybe update or remove. And so integral from day one.
Yeah, I think something we've definitely seen in Similarweb as well is when we give the right solutions, especially around AI, to the GTM folks, and when I say that broadly, whether that's the BDRs or the AEs or the AMs or client success, right? Anything that can help them offload, they're all stressed and have many things on their plate, right?
Mhm.
Anything that helps them kind of focus on the client part and the human connection and things they want to do, they're super grateful for it. So they're very much appreciative, right, of solving that. But, behind that, it's non-trivial. So Amy, let's talk about, all of this, well, as one of our favorite words, agentic
Yeah.
workflow. What does that actually mean? How did you build it? Like, let's get a little bit of geeky here on the details.
Great. Well, I think before we even walk through the four stages here, I think it's very worth calling out that we could have never gotten a project like this off the ground without our partners at Relevance AI that actually enabled us to build this agentic workflow, but also our partners at Similarweb and other vendors. So thank you, Drew, for all those last minute API endpoint requests. But in addition to those vendors and our partners, again, those internal teams that we worked with, really cross-functionally to get that data into our hands safely. So leverage your network internally, externally. It's really going to be the thing that I think gets things done for you. So make friends. But the four stages here. So what this workflow is actually doing. So the leads being queued for outreach, like Julia said. So we've done all this data cleansing, all this work and selection. These accounts have actually crossed that scoring threshold. They've already been enriched. We know who to reach out to. They've already been prioritized all on that data foundation that Julia built. So this agent is not deciding then on who's worth contacting. That decision was made way upstream, right? It's just inheriting a trusted queue and it can get right to work. So pushing it through to the sequence assignment, sequences were assigned automatically based on the region, the vertical, the tier of the advertiser. So this is not persona in the abstract, right? It's an actual commercial segmentation that matters for how we approach any advertiser relationship. So a tier one APAC advertiser is going to get a very different sequence than a mid-market account in the United States because they should. So this leads into that personalized outreach at scale. The data has all of this wonderful live enriched data. The agent has all this live enriched data to craft that individualized outreach and finally push it through to that automated sending. So this is a beautiful thing because not only does it enable that automatic persistence, right, but it does all the tracking as well. So messages go out on that defined schedule within permission and governance rules based on, where the advertiser is. That was already built into that workflow architecture. And I think important to note here as well why this is an agentic chain of agents and not just big one, because I got to be honest with you, we built a really big, massive one at first. But each stage that you just heard, the queuing, the sequencing, and the sending, that is owned by a separate purpose-built agent. Actually, sometimes it's an agent and many sub-agents underneath of it. So one agent, one job, and it's that modularity really that enables us many, many things. So enables us audibility. So when a region's outreach is underperforming, right, we can go in there and know which agent to look at exactly and look at what input caused the problem. So it's also giving us a lot more efficiency. So each little agent or each mini agent only carries context that that step needs, right? So it keeps our token count really efficient and usage clean. But I think important also, it keeps that output quality high. Like I was saying before, our accounts in one region, one tier, one vertical, we want the messaging to be different. When you start conflating all of the messaging into one big agent, right, it tends to underperform. And it also gives us leverage, which I think is probably the most exciting thing for us and other business units, right? So every tool that we have built in this chain is reusable. We've built this once already, and we're already pulling bits and pieces from the tools from this agentic workflow to plug into others.
Amazing. First of all, I take it, I have a lot of PTSD as you were speaking about that, that a lot of the things I tried was also to build this one big, skill or one big agent. And then I was like, thought I was going so well. And then troubleshooting is a nightmare and
Nightmare.
fixing things
Hmm.
and, breaking that up into mini agents, right? Hopefully for those of you who haven't tried this yet, take our experiencing, don't make the same mistakes we made, right? It's, break things down step by step. But Amy, I want to ask you a question because this is something that we talk about the opportunity here, and clearly it worked for you guys. But
Hmm.
one of the things with personalization, right, at scale is that if you get it wrong and it feels like AI, right, it's like, worse than, anything else, right? Because people, you lose trust in you. So I'm really,
Absolutely.
really curious, like, how did you guys validate this? How did you make sure it didn't feel like AI, right? And actually felt like it was coming from a actual BDR? And I'd love to
Mhm.
learn a little bit more about that part.
So the first iteration of Kobe, after we pulled it out of its monolithic version, we had actually a really extensive research agent built into the workflow. And this went out on the web. It did a lot of intensive, deep research into what was going on in the advertiser's world, right? What was going on in the competitor's world. And it was using that to craft messages. But what we actually found is, to your point, maybe that those messages were less reacted to, less opened, and less successful overall. So, and also very expensive, right? Because that research, that deep research out into the World Wide Web can be extremely time consuming and credit consuming as well. So we actually modified this a little as we moved on to V2 of this, just so that we could get that efficiency of scale. And we are more focused on vertical alignment in terms of the outreach there and the messaging.
Amazing.
I'll
And I
just
got,
also add in,
yeah.
what folks can do on this call if they are using AI to write the copy. We put in a lot of guardrails. We had an agent that we called it Brando the brand built. So essentially, it was a brand governance agent, making sure the tone, the way we talked about ourselves was very much in line with what was acceptable. We also did tokenize quite a bit of existing testimonials, KPIs, case studies, and so that it wasn't making up KPIs when discussing a very similar vertical that it was speaking to. And so that was like different flags and ways that we really did try to tighten messaging outside of the research that it was synthesizing and pulling in.
Amazing. And by just internally, just take a note, brand out of branding. I love that. Great creativity on the agent naming, guys. Amazing. And I'm trying. I do want to leave time for Q&A. So let me just move a little bit quickly here. First of all, ultimately what you guys did worked, right? And that's the
Mhm.
best part of this. And I know there's a lot of we've talked about data and outcomes, and I think and cleaning it and creating the workflows and right and how do we do governance and the guardrails, right? And I think for a lot of times customers like ourselves, right, aren't necessarily seeing the success that you guys are yet, right? And they're trying a lot of different things. And so what I'd love to do is just share just a couple of ideas that we're seeing for customers like Rakuten that are successful and what they're doing right on the data side. Because as most of you hopefully on the call know, right, at our core, Similarweb is a data company, right? And we have really a 360-degree digital understanding of what customers are doing, whether it's web or mobile or ad or apps, and on and on and on, and retail data. But it's the question really, and the challenge we have with so many companies is it's moving to this point of where data doesn't matter, outcomes do. And that's
Mm-hmm.
really in the AI world. And so, what our best customers are doing in the first thing is when people used to ask me, right, what is it that Similarweb do? It's not about our data, it's translating that data into what it means for your business, right? So, for example, if I'm an account manager, right? And again, back to this idea of non-revenue generating activity, what I want to know is if I have an account, tell me when that's at risk as soon as possible. I don't want to be where it's too late on renewal. So if we have a signal that they're testing a different technology, I need to know that as soon as that's possible, right? Because that gives me time to defend and see what's going on and why are they testing someone else? Because obviously that's a huge
Mm-hmm.
risk signal, right? And the opposite is true, right? If I'm in terms of prospecting, right, I don't want to have, bad qualified leads. I want the ones that are important. And so, but at the same time, I don't want to wait too late, right? So my team makes fun of me. I love Lululemon. It's not unpaid brand sponsorship here, but you want to find an ex Lululemon before they become Lululemon, right? And so when we think about what we call a new market signal, right? If I'm expanding into a specific region or I want to find next Lululemon, I don't want to get to them when they have 100 visitors, but maybe the threshold is 5,000 visitors, or combining that with a increase in visitors plus 5,000, that they're big enough and getting enough traction where now's the time for me to reach out, but before they're already embedded, right, with another payment solution or another logistics provider. So for us, a big thing of what our customers, right, are looking for is how do we translate this massive and hundreds of data points you have into signals that matter. And I used to say that if you give me one chance to demo SimilarWeb, I would just sell you sales signals. And
Mm-hmm.
I've really, Val, who works for my team, kind of changed my mind on this in that now I say it's the scoring, right? Because, right, you need to look at these signals in context, both in terms of many signals, that it's not always one signal that matters, but also how do you translate that to your business needs, right? Because Rakuten has many businesses and they have many businesses within that large company umbrella. And so each, business unit, and obviously every company needs to say, okay, I get the signal, I get the scoring. Is this a high signal for me, a medium or low, and create that route? But also, it's not just about the things I told you, but for your specific business, how do we create real actionable outcomes that your sellers can take? So, what our best companies are doing is not just taking the sales signals, but then saying, okay, is this a high signal, a medium, or low? And more importantly, when a seller sees this, this is what it means, and do that, right? And so it's really, this concept of taking the data, which we used to say, here's the data, to now, what does that data mean? To now be able to contextualize that and actually score that, to be able to tell me why I should act now, right? Who to reach out to, when, why now, and then what to say, right? And use that data in the outreach messages as well. And so, what we see is that customers then kind of use this data to build company profiles, right? That lead scoring of who do we want to go after, right? How do we know when to reach out, what to say? And then ultimately, the other thing that we're hearing in addition to that non-revenue generating activity, I would say the other main thing I'm hearing from our customers is we want this data in our existing workflows, right? In
Mm-hmm.
our CRM, in Claude, in Cursor, in ChatGPT, in Slack, right? We don't want our sellers, right, having another tool to work with, right? And so all of this work that we talked about and the things that you guys have talked about in the agentic workflow and the data, right? It's we need to put this in the workflow that the customers can do this. But this is not a set it and forget it, right? Mentality, right? Because as much as we've solved this problem, right? What happens is we then have to constantly go and then get that feedback of what's working,
Mm-hmm.
which then feeds, okay, now we need a different profile of customers. Our scoring needs to change, right? All right, which platforms we're using changes. And so, unfortunately for everyone in the audience, hopefully we were able to give you guys some takeaways, right, that are meaningful, but realize that it's not a set it and forget it. And everything, we talked about is going to evolve and change. But I think that's a good segue to talk about the takeaways because we've talked about a lot of things in this 45 minutes so far. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I want to make sure that there's something specific that you can take from this. And so the first takeaway that we spent a lot of time on was this concept of, data quality before automation, right? That garbage in, I think Julia, you said, is garbage out, right? Is that you could spend, if you don't spend the time up front with the data cleansing, then all the results are going to be, garbage. So, Julia, that was a good point. And garbage out, garbage in, garbage out. anything else that's really important for, our participants to hear that's really critical in terms of this concept of data quality?
1,000%. I think kind of even what you alluded to when you were working and building out your own agent, which can be very frustrating. Like agents will not automate you out of bad data, out of misaligned goals, out of scope creep.
Mhm.
You really need to do a lot of heavy lifting, requirement scoping, like before you do any building, because then you know what good looks like. And then you can really understand, the levers that are there. And so, for sure, like Amy's saying before, stakeholder alignment, build bridges across all tech stack owners, get buy-in for the project, understand what an MVP looks like so that you can really talk about early wins. And like we said before, this project served as a basis for so many other automation projects that we have going on. This is, just a drop in the bucket of what we've done here. And so it's not the sexiest work, but it's really important, in building a strong data layer foundation.
I think it's critical. And I think, Amy, you mentioned it many times about getting, making partners. I'll tell you one of the things
Mhm.
I do is if I'm building something new, I'll show it to some folks in the early stages, right? So, for example, one of the things I'm working as a lookalike audience, right? Which is if this is good, show me 10 more companies that look like this. And I'll bring some of
Mhm.
our sellers and say, hey, this is something in the early iteration. This is what I'm working on. And they're so excited, right? And they're bought in from day one, right? And so I think that's really sage advice, right? As well. We also, and again, this brings back to PTSD, but Amy, we talked about the monolithic agent versus mini agents, but I think maybe if you could just drill home why this is so critical.
Yeah, I think anytime you're looking at a process, the first thing to do when you map it end to end, really think about every one of those steps, every one of those hands up, and really the output as well. And we've actually found starting with the output and working backwards is a really good way to do it as well. You're always constantly checking back to that output. So then after that, build one agent per step. I know that the more design work up front, to Julia's point, like it does seem like can be never ending sometimes, right? But dramatically less pain after that at every single level. You can get better personalization when you have little mini agents. The output is fit for that specific situation it's designed for. Again, that audibility when something is underperforming or when something's doing really well, right? You can see exactly what is going on. And if something's broken, you fix that one little piece and it doesn't touch everything else around it. Again, my point on token efficiency, right? Each agent is only doing what it's supposed to be doing. So it's better output overall, lower cost output. But I think really what's really cool is that safe iteration, right? So if you tune an agent to continue to do better, everything else around it is going to run just as it was without any involvement with your changes. So improvement becomes really targeted instead of something that may be ultimately risky.
Yeah, I would say that the whiteboard is your friend here, right? Especially in the
Hmm.
early stages of mapping that out. And I think it's just so critical when you visualize it and try and break it down before you start even, the first line of code, right? That's the most critical thing there. Um, I do want to give a shout out to Imbar for the ratatouille, images here. So I think we talked about the chef idea and kind of what we're cooking up here. But I think, what I heard a lot, Julia and Amy, from you guys was about governance, right? Because, right, we can build amazing things, but it's, how do you get buy-in? Who gets access to what? How do we make sure that things are not overriding CRM? So if you could just
Mhm.
kind of talk to like, one or two takeaways in terms of how to efficiently govern, right, all of these things, which is a really huge change in our workforces today.
Absolutely. And I think when people hear the word governance in an AI context, they think of this really gnarly rules document, right? Somebody wrote it down and put it in Confluence, and now everybody's just kind of supposed to follow it. But I think the real trick to governance is that it is built as part of that workflow structure from the start. The agent doesn't have an option to bypass it, right? So explicit rules about where the data flows through each step, what's coming in, what's getting transferred out, what's being passed forward, and what it cannot touch. And then working closely again with those partners, especially if you are doing anything to their CRM at the end, what it can read, what it can update, what is it creating. And you have to define these at the most precise level possible. So again, the agent can't work around it. And then, as much as we love to say, this agentic workflow worked without, any hands in the loop, There is human checkpoints, and there should be, especially when you are mapping out, you can identify where the stakes are the highest. And it's not because you're not trusting what you're building, right? It's because the highest stakes actions do deserve human review. Just end of story. So how does it not override the CRM? Again, that really precisely defines scope. What can it read? What can it update? What can it create? And Julia's amazing audit trail, right? Every decision, all the data, if something goes wrong, we're able to trace it back. And I think on top of that, a really beautiful Salesforce dashboard as well.
Amazing. Amazing. And I would say kind of finally, the last thing we talked about was this idea that, right, this is incredible, but the bad news is, right, it's not set it and forget it, right? And you guys have seen amazing results, and a lot of our customers are seeing great results from the data we provide them as well. But at the end of the day, right, it's a constant, challenge because things are changing, things are evolving, right? And I think putting in, right, these good governance, putting in the right, idea of mapping things out, all the things we talked about, the first three takeaways, I think do play to the last one of that. This is not, an idea that we're going to do at once. So I do want to leave a few minutes for Q&A, but just to summarize again, and I want to know we want to be clear here, is that we talked a lot a bit, about the data quality for automation, right? Doing a lot of the heavy work about the fact that, you know, just some best advice that don't try and do this all at once, right? That
Mhm.
many agents are much more auditable and much more predictable. This idea of governance we've spent a lot of time on. And again, right, it's going to be evolving, right? Which content's important, which context is important, and which data is important is a constant change. So, before we get to the Q&A, I do want to thank you guys because this is, again, hopefully for our audience, and I know for me personally, it was a lot of fun and also just great takeaways of, two folks in the trenches, right? And Amy and Julia who have done this. And more importantly, have driven real ROI right from that. So, we're super excited and thank you guys again for the time. But with that, let me hand it over to you, Inbar, for, Q&A from our audience.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. So I'll choose some interesting questions. Let me start with a question that was asked here and really interesting. How long did it take to get this running? And also, like, how much of a technical lift it involved?
Yeah. Maybe I'll take a first pass, Amy.
Yeah.
I think the first iteration, the monolith agent, probably took 2 to 3 months to get going. It was a
Mhm.
higher technical lift initially because we had to build one agent to do everything that we wanted to do. So our forward deploy engineer at the agentic platform did help us create SOQL queries and Python scripts, right, and all the API connections. And again, this is the agentic build, not the legwork that we did prior. And so I think now since we've moved to multiple agents that we can now reuse, duplicate across different workforces, it's so much easier to deploy the next iteration. And I believe now, like, we don't need to understand Python script in order to deploy certain agents, but maybe Amy, I'll let you speak to that one.
No, absolutely. They do have a Claude Code plugin available now that has literally 5x my output and really enabled me to build all those nitty-gritty tools that, you need those precise details for.
Yeah, let me just jump on the back of Amy is that I am not a developer at all, but I'm using a
Mhm.
lot of Cloud Cowork and Cursor. And, I just say, tell me stupidly, non-technical person what
Yeah,
this means and how to fix it, right? It's
yeah,
amazing and it's one of the best tools you can. Like to be a builder today, right, is easier than ever, right? And I think the tools that were given, right, that I'm sure the first iteration of this took a while, as you said, but future iterations will be like incredibly fast, right, built on top of that.
yes.
Thank you, guys. I think it also answered the questions of like what tools did you use to build. Um, Another question here was the process of like contact enrichment systems and agentic workflows that you could recommend on the process of contact enrichment.
Yes. Do you want to take that one, Amy, or?
Yeah, I can. So we used several different options. Similarweb was one of them in the mix. We also used a separate company to enrich the data. We found it extremely useful. And again, something that we can take from this one piece and reuse it any time across the business where we are looking to enrich contact data, including for our own current book of business, right? Not only for new prospects. Um, there are many, many companies out there that do this. Similarweb was a very easy build right into the workforce, especially since we were already using it for the traffic assessment.
What I'll add too is initially we built it in mind where, the agent was also outreaching on behalf of the BDR. But I think we quickly realized there were many different use cases that reps would
Hmm.
want to also enrich their accounts that they were going after. And so I believe, not to speak on behalf of you, Amy, but you built a Slack bot where depending on the account that they were prospecting, they could leverage the same tool that we already built within, the initiative we talked about before to now prospect their accounts without the outreach piece. And so
Yeah.
again, just removing any manual processes or labor for them to have to, go after, certain personas.
Yeah, I think on the similar website, I think something we've seen right on the contact side, right? And we're not a content company, we provide that. We're really a
Mhm.
data company, but even on that side, we're moving ourselves to a waterfall approach of working with many more vendors, right? And therefore being able to kind of, not be limited to a specific set of vendors, but go
Mhm.
choose that waterfall, prioritize that how you want, because everyone's, especially when you're a global company like yourselves, is that content quality is going to vary by provider in different regions. And so being able to provide, the ability for our customers to, create this waterfall and then prioritize that. And again, it's coming very, very soon. So keeping an eye out for that. But it's something our GTM is excited about themselves. So I
Mhm.
think that's our approach when it comes to contacts. And then the other thing I was going to say is I think to your points, it's really interesting, right? Because we built specific tool for a specific audience, like you guys did in terms of BDRs, and then other parts of the organization, right, want to use it. So it's something we've seen as well, which is that, this thirst for helping, GTM is so critical. And wherever they can get help, they consume it and they're so excited about it. And Bar, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, one more question about hyper personalization in scale in outreach, meaning how can I create the research and the prompt inputs and the persona context and AI generated messages into
Mhm.
outreach and push it into outreach?
Yeah, I can help.
So,
Or, oh,
okay.
Amy, go for it.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so great question. Like we mentioned before, there's a lot of different data points for the BDR to look at in order to synthesize and create that super personalized messaging. And so what we had done is we had created agents that did each function, whether it was looking up that company online or using Similarweb to pull all of the data about that company. Or then using another agent to look up that person on LinkedIn to see if there are any
Mhm.
title changes. And so, what we had our agent do is really start to summarize based on the account. So this could be external information or also internal information based on existing activities, closed lost deals in the past, right? Like what have they been doing with other reps on that particular account in the history of that account. So a summary of on the account. We also had summary fields on the prospects themselves, again, to synthesize all of the research and then using those summary fields we also fed in additional data dictionaries that talk through our value propositions against each vertical, against each persona, the different testimonials and KPIs we may have wanted the messaging to include. And then it would synthesize all information in another agent to craft the message and then push that into our outreach platform. Hopefully that answered it for you.
Yeah,
Amazing. So,
yeah, Amber, let me just jump 1 second. I would say, kind of, on the similar website, I would say two things. One, and I think difference between agentic workflows, right, or agents, right, are making calls versus, humans is we've built a number of different agents. So a prepare for a meeting agent or an outbound, right? And so, when our agents are calling it, right, they may call our, outreach agent that inserts similar web insights and those signals we talked about that can then be
Mhm.
pushed into a cadence, right? From a human perspective, what's interesting is what we saw was a little different behavior. Is that, let's say someone was using our prepare for a meeting agent, the follow-up prompts would be, okay, now draft an email, right? And so we put together a super app that then gives access to all of the agents that we've built. And we've seen a very fundamental shift where customers are now going towards the super agent to talk about
Mhm.
like I want to, prepare for a meeting and then I want to draft a question and I want to do this. I think on the agentic workflow, we're exposing all of the different agents, right, to, right, this, whatever agent is running that and it's calling different agents. But the idea of automating that and providing that available, right, either as, kind of in a platform as a super agent versus, via MCP or agent to agent to be able to actually allow that to be used as well.
Okay, I think that's it on the question side. Thank you.
Guys, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. As we mentioned, we will send a recording. And if we didn't get to your question, we'll actually do our best to try and follow up with you directly as well. But thank you so much. And really, Amy and Julia and Inbar and Ella and everyone on the team who did this, really thank you so much. I had a great time. I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. And really, thanks again for your time.